funny the way opinions work in people. Sometimes we answer questions according to the people we're surrounded by. Sometimes we speak based on the preset conditions our past is kind of molded within our minds about the questions. And very rarely do we discuss things based solely on our own individually developed thoughts, gained through knowledge that we've personally sought after. When I was very young, my parents came to this country from Cuba and took me with them on a small boat built for a handful of people, but holding a little over 25. We were taken away to Guantanamo Bay Camp, and we lived there for over 8 months in cots, and surrounded by the military men and women looking after the refugee camps. I don't remember much, but I can remember listening to them speak and not understanding a word they said. There were a few of the men that would bring candy from the US for the kids, and I've been told plenty of stories of a crush that I had on one particular soldier who would always bring me coloring books from his home, this far-off land that I knew someday I'd get to. I didn't know it then, but I was building up a life on a language. I was taking the pieces I thought were real and combining the little clues that I had to make up a whole life on this language I didn't understand, but I wanted to know. Growing up in West Palm Beach, an hour and a half from Miami, meant growing up in a different world. After I turned about 14, we moved into a mansion on the beach owned by one of the world's most wealthy families. We lived in the second floor of an addition to their estate, and my parents both worked in the house downstairs. The family that owned the house bathed in a wealth that was always nearby, but I knew I could never touch or experience by myself or by my family. My parents always kept a watchful eye over how I viewed the family, making sure that I wasn't envious or that I never wanted for anything beyond comfort. My perspective on my culture and native language was forever separated by the wealth of the English language, or at least the language that I grew up in, the wealth that meant, the connections that they brought. Stanford psychology professor Lara Brodowski, she wrote, "It turns out that if you change how people talk, that changes how they think. If people learn another language, they inadvertently also learn a new way of looking at the world. When bilingual people switch from one language to another, they start thinking differently too." I couldn't agree with this more. She makes a pretty great point. So it's because of this that I wanted to ask others about their opinions. I wanted to step out of the paradigm that I grew up in and the whatever perspectives that I had, and I wanted to ask other people about theirs. I asked friends, I asked family, I asked people that I work with, I asked people that came from different backgrounds that wanted different things, that grew up in different ways than I did. And I realized that the way I grew up is very rare, but I wanted to hear from other people beyond what I knew, what I had experienced. And I got some pretty great answers.
A language that has been around for a while, or in like a family or some sort of like tradition?
I would describe a native tongue as what you were born into.
A mother tongue, a native tongue, it's what, like, the language that's spoken in your family, your first language. It's what you first learn.
Yeah.
I would say mother language is the language that you can identify the most with and feels the most natural to you. It's probably what you think in your head, the language that you think about is probably what I would say mother language is.
I believe that a native tongue or a mother tongue is the one that you were first brought up to speak. Maybe not the first one that you learned how to read or write, but the first one that you could speak and somewhat have conversations with.
I'm Venezuelan, so we don't speak Venezuelan, but we speak Spanish, and I don't know, I would say it's pretty different. Growing up, Spanish was my first language, so I came here when I was 3, and I learned English pretty quickly. So my Spanish has kind of been fading out, I guess we could say, since I'm not really around as many Venezuelans and anyone who's Spanish. Well, I am now that I live in Miami, but I've noticed that I've lost a lot of, those things that Venezuelans say, or, certain words or the way you speak.
So then the big change, or the big impact on me as a person and the way I interact with people in Miami compared to Broward is more like a child sitting at the adult table, where you're in an observation mode more frequently than you are in a participating or instigating mode. In other words, I'm not likely to start a conversation with somebody in Miami because I know that most of the time they don't speak my language or won't understand what I'm saying. I won't participate in a conversation frequently in Miami because I don't understand the context, or I can't keep up with how quickly they speak their language. So I'm stuck observing, and I observe areas of people. I observe the way they interact with each other, and I can tell what the energy of the conversation is, whether they're fighting or agreeing with each other, or if they're questioning or joking, but I cannot participate. And because of that, I might be seen as a independent or a loner, or maybe even shunned socially because of my inability to communicate. In my community, for example, in my condominium association, the older Cuban women don't like me in a racial sense, just because they've never had an opportunity to understand me.
So as it turns out, the more questions that I asked and the more that we had these discussions with some of the people that I was interviewing, the more I realized that identity and language are one and the same. They have much more to do with each other than I previously considered. Nancy Budwig wrote an article for Clark University titled Language and the Construction of Self, Developmental Reflections, in which she discusses the different characteristics that there are when considering language as a sense of identity. And the more questions that I asked, the more the discussion turned into a cultural sense of self. That language was not just this accessory that we had worn, that every day we wake up and look in the mirror and we put on our language. In fact, it is a living, breathing addition within ourselves, a living, breathing part of who we are as a whole, something that we can never take away from. We can only add on to as it happens.
I'd say that both of them affect you in different ways. Perhaps when you're in a Spanish environment, you would think mostly in Spanish, or even, fall back to certain words that you wouldn't choose in English because of your Spanish influence. Also, I would believe that, if you do study English more, you may lean more towards English rather than Spanish.
That's a big ass question. I think language overall is something that it depends on how aware of it you are. The more aware of it you are and the way that you present yourself, it can be better for you or worse for you. Sometimes people don't realize the amount language influences. Even if you were to use accents, the minute I left Miami, people knew that I was from Miami. Or not me, but I had a friend that did that. So she knew that she had a different, the manner of how she presented herself was something that was different apart from everybody else.
I think your mother language, like you asked earlier, is a very big percentage of your self-identity. And yes, I do think it is a lot of ourselves, and it's a big part of who we are. For me personally, the mixture of English and Spanish that I have is exactly what I consider myself, a mix. I wouldn't say it's a tug of war, because they're not putting against each other. I would say it's more of a mixture or a solution or an infusion.
I think you should be defined by the language that you grow into loving. Just because that kind of describes your personality, just because you're more attracted to that. You get me? If something was forced upon you, like a different language, just to communicate, I don't think that really defines you. I think the language should define you instead. So.
A new factor that occurred as I was having these discussions with people was another layer to language as identity. Now, not only was language an identity, but your identity was also being judged by people. So you were so much how you spoke and how you were and how your culture was that you were judged for it, that you are judged for it. People in the street, people that see you from day to day, you yourself, maybe without even thinking about it. I started asking questions as to judgment based on identity, which was based on language. All of these were layers of the same core idea of sense of self and of definition. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that.
Yes.
How?
I think it depends on how snobby the person is. I mean, there's a lot of Americans here that feel that the Hispanic contingent of the country needs to learn how to speak English. I myself am really picky. Like, I don't like very strong Cuban accents. If, for example, Gabriel, when he starts speaking, my boyfriend. Yeah. When he starts joking around with me and he'll like start saying, "Oye mami, ¿qué tú quieres?" Like I cannot do that.
Okay, go.
I too tend to stereotype people that they can, based on their language. Anyone that's like speaks perfect Spanish to me, I think is like foreign, and they weren't born here. But I speak it rather well, and sometimes I think I'm not from here. So I tend to fool myself.
But it happens all the time. I always get asked what part of Cuba you're from. I'm like, none of the above. I was born here in Miami. So that's the only thing I think of stereotype for anyone.
I've been to Michigan and Georgia, and people like pick it up like this even when they look at you. You get me? Especially when you start like talking like Spanish with your friends or your family when you're up there. Like I don't think like you get judged highly like a lot, but you do notice like some tension.
What I was saying is it's interesting because different cultures, the way they speak their language, not the language itself in the sense of how it sounds or the translation of words, but the way it's spoken is different. So, for example, French and Spanish is a very fluid language that rolls into each other, and it's actually meant to roll, and words were created that rolled well together. Chinese or Asian languages are meant to be spoken quickly, so they don't roll. They're very staccato. They're very quick. And because of that, when they translate their language into English per se, it changes the way we interpret them as a person. Not because they're speaking our language or they speak their language, but the way they speak our language, the fluidity or the motion of the language actually changes the way you see their character. For example, if I was speaking English and I spoke it very fast and very choppy like this, you would think that I was weird or that I was overstimulated, or it would say things about my personality, as compared to if I was very flowing and going with it, just like as if it were French or Italian. You might consider me more feminine as a person. But in reality, the super masculine of the French people or the Italian people who speak those languages, or even Spanish, have fluidity by nature. So when they translate their language to English, they also have to translate their presentation of language.
Okay, so that question in regards to language, if it's somebody else that speaks a different language than you, I'm a nurse, so I can talk from experience. When we have someone like a patient that speaks a different language, we have to not only look at the language they speak in, but also their physical way, their body language. That is extremely important in the sense, for example, if it's somebody from the Asian origin, normally they don't look at you straight in the eyes. They try to be more, they look more down and stuff like that. And language is in the sense of like not only it's the way they speak, but it's the body language that you have to look at.
As the conversation continued, and there was many conversations on the subject, their theories on language as a self-definition evolved. The more individually that I spoke to a person, the more that their explanations changed, and the more that they wanted to discuss their own personal experiences, because that's all we have is our own personal view and our own experiences in order to relate back to some of the questions that I was asked. After doing a bit more research on the subject, I came to find that identity might just refer to the way we conceive ourselves as individuals or as members of groups or societies, whereas language requires a bit more of a nuanced definition. So language was a polished down version of who we are, who we think ourselves to be, because language is not just this one entity that can be defined by the way that it's spoken, but it comes with all of the baggage of how it's spoken, in what sense and what terms, who is the one speaking, for what reason, the culture that you have behind you, the culture that you have behind the person listening. There's 1,000 little parts of what language is, and it isn't just like a dress that we can wear, that we can put on ourselves. It isn't an accessory, but it is who we are, who we've been, and who we will be. Language can change as just as easily as we can change. We are self-defined by the parts that make us, that make what self is.